This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert.
In the name of God, source of all being, incarnate Word, and Holy Spirit. Last Sunday, and particularly around November 1st, was the celebration and feast of All Saints. And that major feast is a sharp turning point in the journey through the church year, from sort of our routine walking through all the gospel lessons and Jesus activities and so forth. But at this point, at the end of the year, as our secular year begins to turn toward the end, the church liturgy and the scriptures switch gears very decidedly toward the end times, the end things, eschatology, the coming of the kingdom, the coming of Christ, building up to a head on Advent Sunday, where this comes to a climax. This is the traditional time of year for subjects. The traditional subjects are death and judgment, heaven and hell. Now that I've got your attention, it's interesting that the gospel today is under that umbrella. It's about resurrection and about the resurrected life and what happens to us after we die. And indeed, it's hard to know a lot about that, because it's another world than the one we know, except for a few clues. In our story, the Sadducees, that was the traditionalist party at the time, in that day of Israel, they were very rigid, very narrow, tended to be on the conservative side. They were kind of wrapped around the worship in the temple. They were very ritualistic, and they didn't believe in the resurrection. They only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament. As opposed to the Pharisees, who were the more progressive side. And we all think of Jesus fighting with the Pharisees all the time, but he was actually more in line with them than the Sadducees. So they are confronting Jesus with this question, which is pretty absurd. They certainly are not interested in a dialogue about what it's like after we die. They want to catch him. And I can imagine a little smile or smirk on their faces as they say to Jesus, well, there was this woman, if you'd answer the question, she died without kids, and the brother married her to raise up kids. That was Levirate marriage. That was a common thing in the ancient world. We wouldn't relate to that. And they go on with this absurd story that 7 brothers, all of them flunked. No kids after 7 brothers, and I feel sorry for that lady. She had nothing to say about this, of course. That was the system then, because the only life after death that Sadducees believed in, and many others, was, through your progeny, those who live on beyond you and carry on your name. And Jesus explains patiently, I'm sure, well, you guys don't know what you're talking about. This world is completely, in that sense, different from the world to come, the resurrected life. There is no direct continuity. And so in the kingdom of God, the resurrected life, we're like angels. That is, there's no need to make kids anymore, or to have progeny, or to perpetuate the species. We're beyond that. It's a different world. It's an entirely different ballgame. You guys really don't know what you're talking about. It's a different world altogether. Kind of like the fanatic golfer who loved his golf fanatically. Weekend after weekend he was playing all over the place. And then he dies and goes to hell. I'm not sure because he was playing golf, but he went to hell. And he asked the devil rather anxiously at the opening interview, well, are there golf courses down here in hell? Obviously, he wanted to keep on playing. And the devil said, oh, of course, there's all kinds of golf courses down here. Beautiful greens, they go on forever, great clubhouses. It's just really marvelous. You'll really love them. Then the man says, well, now where do I get the clubs and the balls? And the devil said, well, we don't have any clubs or balls. That's the hell of it. Different world, different rules, different ballgame. Well, we don't have a lot of data to go on, but the primary witness we have is the one person you and I know who's been there and come back to tell about it. We call that Easter. We call that the risen one. And from those Easter stories, we get a clue as to what life after death looks like. First of all, on the one side of the coin, there is definitely a corporeality or a physicality to Jesus' resurrection. He has He's recognized. After initially not recognizing him, they can see that it's Jesus. And especially he is authenticated by the signs of the torture in his body. Those signs never go away. They are eternal. They represent our wounds, by the way. And so those are always the authentic signs that this is the real Jesus and not somebody's imagination. He even invites Thomas, the apostle, to touch me. Stick your hand on my side and decide for yourself that it's really me. And in Luke's gospel on Easter night, I think this is really funny. Great humor in the Bible, at least in English. Jesus has appeared, and they thought he was dead, of course, so they're blowing their minds. I'm imagining people calling 911, popping pills, slipping out the back door through the kitchen because they don't know what's going on. The police will be here any minute. And while they're all freaking out, Jesus, the risen one, stands there and says, "You got anything here to eat?" I love it. And we're told that he eats a piece of fish right in front of him. Very physical. Now, on the other hand, we're also talking about someone who appears at will behind and through locked doors. He's no longer limited by time or space. And by the way, that's the world you and I live in. We are limited by time and space. We can't be in London and Connecticut and here and on the West Coast and in Mongolia all at the same time. We are limited by time and space. We can't go through walls. But this Jesus apparently can. So something very radical has happened, and you might just call it a radical transformation into a new reality that, frankly, it's pretty hard to talk about because the tools we have are the tools of this world, not that world. All we can do is tell the story of what they experienced and pass it on. And clearly, the resurrection is not the resuscitation of a corpse. Resuscitated corpses die again and ain't going to convince anybody to believe in anything. Remember, Jesus reportedly raised several people from the dead, Jairus' daughter, the widow of Nain, but they died again. And in our Easter proclamation, we say that Christ has been risen from the dead. He will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. It's been conquered. It's over. It's a new world. And that new world is different. So, what that means in practical terms is, and I'm suspecting that no one in this room has not lost someone they love. You know, if you know someone that you loved and cared about who died from the ravages of cancer, guess what? They don't have cancer anymore. If you knew someone who was crippled or couldn't walk or had pain in their bodies and was hard to get around, that's no longer a problem anymore. They're leaping. If someone was poor and miserable and couldn't decide how to spend money, whether it was on gas or groceries or health care, those worries are gone. In God's kingdom, there's no management or labor or officers or enlisted or people who are rich and powerful and important. You're not powerful and important anymore. You're in the resurrected life. It's a new ball game. And I'm happy to report in the resurrected life, donuts are no longer bad for you. I think we get a sense of this in our own American history, in that original sin of America, of slavery, that for 400 years a group of human beings lived under horrible, horrible conditions. There was very little hope in those days about getting out of that mess. And much of the music of the Negro spirituals, the folk traditions of the songs they sing, and some of which we sing today, all wrapped around not so much this world, but the next world, where things will finally be made better. And it wasn't an escapist pie-in-the-sky kind of thing, although sometimes it gets characterized that way. They just knew that no matter how bad things were now, God's going to turn everything upside down, which is exactly what All Saints is all about when we read the gospel of, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall rejoice. Blessed are the poor, for they shall see God. Blessed are those who are upset now, they will be filled," and so forth. "Blessed are the meek, they will inherit the earth." Everything's going to go upside down. And in God's kingdom, there is no slavery. Over. Out. Well, for all of that, nonetheless, it is hard for us to talk about or say a lot with any really serious confidence about a world we really haven't experienced yet. We only have clues and hints, and a God who says he's a God of the living and loves us no matter what. There are parables that might hint. For example, some of you may remember Jonathan Livingston Seagull. There was a little parable about eternal life. Frankly, the new physics, quantum mechanics, have told us amazing things about what we thought was true about life and aren't true anymore necessarily. That two things can be opposite and still be at the same time true. That things out of nothing can be created. I don't pretend to understand that very much, but quantum mechanics and the new physics have turned everything upside down. There may be a lot more to this new life than we think. For myself, I think the most interesting witness in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 decades has been the research we know as near-death experience. Many, many, many thousands of people have reported a remarkable common experience of certain things that happen when they've been pronounced dead or thought to be dead and somehow were resuscitated. And this research is still going on. There are now doctors tracking this. Not all the answers are there yet about the chemistry and the physics of this, to be sure. But we now know it's an international phenomenon. It's not just something in the West. And these different experiences, the tunnel, the vision, the life review, the noise, floating over the body, that stuff is reported all over the world in all different cultures. And it's being even more and more taken seriously. There are several books out now by physicians about this, and several books by physicians who have experienced it themselves. I've got them on my shelf. The one thing that's really interesting about that phenomena is that almost without exception, the people who have experienced near-death experiences, almost without exception, they may not have all had the noise or the floating or the tunnel or the being of light, which is interesting, but the one thing in common they have is they are no longer afraid to die. The fear is gone. Perhaps because they've had a glimpse, a faint hint, such as we get in the scriptures and on Easter morning. It's not about the flowers, it's about a glimpse into another world that God has promised, because he's the God of the living, not of the dead. There's a true story that captures this for me, and I sum this up with this parable, that a young man who was on an Ivy League football team, loved to play, but he was lousy. The coach dreaded to see him showing, but he was dedicated and faithful, and he showed up at all the practices, but he just didn't have it. Well, the big game was approaching, the final year, the end of the year, and he knocked on the coach's door and said, "Coach, I need to ask permission to skip the practices the next couple of weeks. My father just died, and I obviously need to go take care of that." And the coach was certainly understanding and said, "Don't worry, it's okay." He remembered seeing his dad off in a distance at the games in the bleachers, but didn't really know him or hadn't met him. He said, "Of course, take all the time you need and don't worry about the final game. It'll be fine." Well, sure enough, about 2 days before the big game, which they were predicted to lose, the young man knocks on the coach's door again and says, "Coach, I really want to ask a favor. Would you let me play in the big game for my dad? Could I do that for him? I would really appreciate that." Well, you can imagine the dilemma of the coach. He's a nice guy, but they got to win this game, and he's being paid a lot of money. They get paid a lot of money to do these things. And he wants to win, and there are 2 touchdowns predicted to lose. And he's agonizing over this, but he's feeling for the kid. And finally he says, all right, I'll let you play, at least a little bit, for your dad. So he wrestles with that all night and tosses and turns. Oh, my gosh. I know that kid gets a ball anywhere near him, he's going to fumble it, and there it goes, and the whole thing's lost. And oh, geez. Well, I'll tell you what. He wakes up in the morning and says, I'll let him in on the opening kickoff, maybe a couple plays, and then I'll pull him out. At least that'll meet his request. So sure enough, he gets out there on the field, and sure enough, the kickoff goes, you know where, right in front of this kid. And the coach has a very near a cardiac infarction. And the kid picks up the ball, doesn't fumble, roars that thing like greased lightning right up to the halfway line, and makes an amazing comeback. Everybody's sort of stunned, and what happened? And he leaves them in, and a couple plays later, he gets the ball and takes it 25 yards. He runs, and he's greased lightning, and he goes through all these blockers and makes an amazing run. And everybody sort of, where's this kid been? Anyway, long story short, he leaves it in the game. He's doing so well, and he finally gets a touchdown. Pat takes the ball, all kinds of yardage, like nothing they've ever seen before. And he, go with the winner, don't mess with it. He leaves them in the game, and sure enough, they win by 2 touchdowns. And everybody's celebrating in the locker room and popping the champagne and the balloons. And the coach finally can't stand it anymore, and he says, "Hey, kid, come here." And he says, takes him over to the side and says, "You've never played like that. What happened out there? I mean, I got to be honest, son, you weren't very good, and he didn't really want you to be in there very long, and you were incredible today. You scored 2 touchdowns and didn't fumble. What happened?" And the kid said, "Well, Coach, I'm not sure I really know, but, my dad was blind, and this is the first time he ever got to see me play. This is the first time he ever got to see me play." Some might find that a little bit sentimental, but frankly, I think it's a capture of what Jesus is trying to explain to the Sadducees that they can't get. That we're in a new ball game, pun intended. We're in a new world in the resurrected life. Our God is a God of the living, not of the dead. And so this applies not just to those you love whom you miss, who may have died with impediments. Not only are their impediments gone, and you can rejoice in that, but it applies to us as well. The Sadducees are dead. They disappeared after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. They're gone. Jesus is not gone. He is a God of the living, not of the dead. And when a stethoscope is placed on your chest, or someone you love, and some doctor says, it's the end of the journey, at least as far as this world goes, you know and I know that that's only an end that leads to a new beginning, even if we don't understand it very well. He is a God of the living, and he loses nothing that he loves. So it applies to us. We are his people, and God doesn't lose things that he loves. He's a God of the living. And I suspect, I may not know much about hell, but I suspect in heaven, there will be clubs and balls to play with. Amen.